I was standing on the porch of my ranch house when I saw the silver Mercedes kick up dust on the long gravel driveway, and I knew right then that my peaceful morning was about to turn into something else entirely. The car pulled up near the main gate, and out stepped a woman in her mid-50s wearing what looked like a business suit completely inappropriate for the New Mexico heat, carrying a leather folder like it was some kind of weapon. "Can I help you?" I called out, walking down the steps with my coffee mug still in hand. "Are you Kenneth Quinn?" she asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "That's me. I'm Barbara Henderson, president of the Desert Vista Homeowners Association. We need to discuss your outstanding dues immediately." I stopped walking and just stared at her. "I'm sorry, what?" She opened her folder with a dramatic flourish and pulled out several sheets of paper. "According to our records, this property falls within the boundaries of Desert Vista HOA, established in 2019. You owe 6 years of back dues, late fees, and penalties totaling $47,000. I actually laughed. I could not help it. "Madam, I think you've got the wrong address. This ranch has been in my family since 1952. We're not part of any HOA. Barbara's expression hardened. "I assure you, Mr. Quinn, our legal team has thoroughly reviewed the property boundaries. When Desert Vista was developed 3 miles east of here, the incorporation documents included all properties within a 5-mile radius to ensure uniform community standards. That's insane. You can't just declare someone's property part of your HOA without their consent. The state of New Mexico allows HOAs to establish reasonable boundaries for community welfare. Your property's appearance has been a source of numerous complaints from Desert Vista residents. Peeling paint on outbuildings, non-compliant fencing, livestock visible from the main road, and several vehicles that appear to be in various states of disrepair." I took a long drink of my coffee, trying to process what I was hearing. "This is a working cattle ranch. It's supposed to look like a ranch. And those vehicles you're talking about? That's my truck that needs a new transmission, and my grandfather's old Ford that I'm restoring. Be that as it may, Desert Vista has standards, and more importantly, you have outstanding financial obligations." She handed me a stack of papers. "This is a formal notice. You have 30 days to pay the full amount, or will be forced to place a lien on your property." I took the papers mostly out of shock. "This is ridiculous. I'm not paying you a single cent." "Then I suggest you obtain legal counsel. Mr. Quinn, the HOA has never lost a case like this." She turned on her heel and walked back to her Mercedes, leaving me standing there in the dust with a stack of legal threats in my hand. After she drove away, I went inside and called my lawyer, Tom Rodriguez, who I'd known since high school. His office was in Albuquerque, about an hour's drive north. "Tom, I need you to look at something completely insane," I said when he answered. "How insane are we talking?" "HOA claiming my ranch owes them $47,000 insane." There was a pause. "Your ranch? The Quinn Ranch out near Pueblo territory? That's the one." "Ken, you're not in an HOA. That's what I told the woman who showed up at my door this morning. She says otherwise. Send me the documents. I'll take a look and call you back." I scanned everything Barbara had given me and emailed it to Tom, then spent the rest of the day trying to work but mostly just fuming about the whole situation. The Quinn Ranch sat on 800 acres of high desert grassland, beautiful country with views of the Sandia Mountains to the north. My grandfather had bought it after World War II, and my father had expanded the cattle operation in the 70s. When Dad passed away 5 years ago, the ranch came to me. It was not just property. It was family history, family legacy. Tom called me back that evening. "Okay, I've reviewed everything. This is either incredibly incompetent or deliberately fraudulent." "Which one?" "I'm leaning toward fraudulent. The HOA incorporation documents show boundaries that include your ranch, but there's no record of any notification to you or your father before that. New Mexico law requires property owners to be notified and given the option to join or contest inclusion in an HOA. So what do we do?" "I'm going to file a response contesting their claim. But Ken, I have to warn you, fighting an HOA can be expensive. They have deep pockets from all their members' dues, and they can drag this out." "I'm not paying them, Tom. This is principle. I figured you'd say that. I'll get started on the paperwork." Over the next 2 weeks, I tried to focus on running the ranch. We had about 200 head of cattle that needed constant attention, fences to maintain, equipment to repair. My ranch hand, Miguel Santos, had been working with me for 15 years, and his son Carlos had joined us a few years back. They were family as much as employees. "What's eating at you, boss?" Miguel asked one afternoon while we were checking water tanks in the south pasture. I told him about Barbara and the HOA situation. Miguel shook his head. "That's crazy. How can they claim land that's not theirs? Apparently they think they can just draw lines on a map and make it true." "You should talk to Thomas Whitehorse," Miguel said. "Who's that?" "He's on the tribal council for the Pueblo. His ranch borders yours to the west, remember? Big guy, quiet. I see him at the feed store sometimes. I did remember. I'd met Thomas a handful of times over the years, mostly nodding hellos when we passed each other on the rural roads. Why would he be able to help? Because the Pueblo has been fighting off developers and land grabs for decades. They know how to deal with this stuff. It was good advice. I made a note to reach out to Thomas when I got back to the house, but before I could do that, Barbara showed up again. This time she had 2 other people with her, a man and a woman, both wearing business attire and carrying clipboards. Mr. Quinn, since you haven't responded to our initial notice, we're here to conduct a property inspection and document violations, Barbara announced as they got out of their vehicles. You're not setting foot on my property, I said, walking down the porch steps to meet them. The HOA bylaws give us the right to inspect any property within our jurisdiction to ensure compliance with community standards, the man said. He was younger than Barbara, maybe 40, with slicked back hair and an attitude that immediately rubbed me wrong. And you are? Richard Pemberton, HOA legal counsel. Well, Richard, my legal counsel says you have no jurisdiction here, so I'm going to have to ask you all to leave. Barbara pursed her lips. Mr. Quinn, you're making this much harder than it needs to be. If you would simply pay your dues and bring your property up to code, we could all move forward. Up to code? This is a cattle ranch. It's an eyesore, Barbara snapped. Do you have any idea how many complaints we receive? Desert Vista residents paid good money for their homes, and they shouldn't have to look at rusted equipment and dilapidated barns. Then they shouldn't have built their cookie-cutter development next to a working ranch. The woman with Barbara spoke up for the first time. The HOA is prepared to offer you a payment plan for the outstanding dues. We're not unreasonable people. I'm not paying anything because I don't owe you anything. Now please leave before I call the sheriff. Richard stepped forward. If you interfere with our inspection, we can obtain a court order. That will only add to your legal fees and delays. Try it, I said flatly. We stared at each other for a long moment before Barbara huffed and gestured to the others. Let's go. Mr. Quinn will understand the seriousness of his situation soon enough. After they left, I immediately called Tom. They just tried to inspect my property, I told him. Did you let them? Hell no. Good. Don't let them on your land for any reason. I'm filing an emergency motion to halt any HOA action against your property until we can get a hearing. But Ken, this is escalating fast. They're playing hardball, so am I. That evening, I drove over to Thomas Whitehorse's ranch. It was smaller than mine, maybe 300 acres, but beautifully maintained. The house was a mix of traditional and modern architecture, and horses grazed in a pasture near the main road. Thomas answered the door. A tall man with long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. He looked at me with patient, intelligent eyes. Kenneth Quinn, I said, extending my hand. We've met a few times. I ranch east of here. I know who you are, he said, shaking my hand. His grip was firm. What brings you by? I explained the situation with the HOA. Thomas listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Come inside. We should talk about this properly." His living room was comfortable, filled with family photos and Native American art. He gestured for me to sit and poured us both coffee. The Desert Vista HOA has been a problem, Thomas said, settling into a chair across from me. They've tried to extend their authority to several properties in this area. Most people can't afford to fight them, so they either pay or sell. That's their game? Part of it. Some of the HOA board members are also real estate investors. They acquire properties that can't afford the dues and violations, then flip them to developers. That's got to be illegal. It is, but proving it is difficult. They hide behind corporate structures and use legitimate HOA authority to mask what's really happening. Thomas took a sip of his coffee. But your situation might be different. How so? When was your ranch established? My grandfather bought it in 1952. From whom? I had to think about that. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the deed. Thomas leaned forward. Kenneth, there's a reason the Pueblo hasn't had problems with Desert Vista trying to claim our land. It's because our land rights are protected under federal treaty law. The HOA can't touch us. Okay, but I'm not part of the Pueblo. No, but some of the land around here has complicated history. Before your grandfather bought that property, it might have been part of the original Pueblo land grant. If it was, and if it was never properly transferred out of that status, then it could still be protected. I felt a flicker of hope. How do I find out? Start with your deed. Look at the chain of title going back as far as you can. And I'll have someone from the tribal legal office look into the historic boundaries of our land grant. If your property sits on land that was never properly separated from the Pueblo, that changes everything. Why would that matter to my case? Because the HOA has no authority over tribal land or land protected under tribal treaties. Federal law supersedes state law, which supersedes HOA bylaws. If your ranch is on protected land, the HOA's claim is invalid on its face. I left Thomas's ranch feeling energized. As soon as I got home, I went digging through my father's old filing cabinets. He had been meticulous about keeping records, and sure enough, I found a folder labeled Property Deeds and Documents. The original deed from 1952 was there, yellowed with age but still legible. My grandfather had purchased the land from the Bureau of Land Management. That was interesting, federal land. I kept reading through the chain of title, working backward through sales and transfers. There were gaps, places where the documentation was unclear or referenced other documents I did not have. I scanned everything and sent it to Tom with a note explaining what Thomas had told me. Tom called me first thing the next morning. "This is promising, Ken. BLM land sales in the 50s were complicated, especially in New Mexico, where you had overlapping Spanish land grants, Mexican territorial claims, Pueblo treaties, and federal jurisdiction all tangled up together. Can you make sense of it? I'm going to need help. Let me reach out to a specialist in Native American land law. This is outside my usual practice area. Do whatever you need to do." While Tom worked on the legal research, the HOA ramped up their harassment. I started receiving daily letters, each one more threatening than the last. They claimed I was in violation of dozens of bylaws, everything from my barn's paint color to the height of my fence posts to the type of gravel in my driveway. Each violation came with a fine, and the fines were adding up fast. Then they started contacting my neighbors. I found out when Emma Morrison, who owned a small horse ranch about 2 miles away, called me. "Ken, I got the weirdest visit today," she said. "Woman from the HOA came by asking questions about your property." "What kind of questions?" "Whether you had permits for your outbuildings, whether your cattle ever got loose, whether you had water rights issues." I told her I didn't know anything and she should mind her own business. But it was strange. "Why are they asking about you?" I explained the situation to Emma, who was appropriately outraged. "That's insane. Everyone around here knows the Quinn Ranch. You can't just declare it part of an A. Try telling them that. What are you going to do?" "Fight it. I've got a lawyer working on it." But the HOA was not just gathering information from neighbors. A few days later, Miguel came to the house looking concerned. "Boss, I think someone was on the property last night." "What makes you say that?" "Found tire tracks down by the south gate this morning. Fresh ones, and the gate was unlocked. I always kept that gate locked. It led to a section of the ranch that bordered the main highway, and I did not want random people wandering in." "Could have been kids," I said, but I did not really believe it. "Maybe. But those tire tracks look like they came from a nice vehicle. Not the kind kids would be driving." I went down to check it out myself. Miguel was right. The tracks were from expensive tires, probably from an SUV or sedan. Someone had driven through the gate and gone about 50 yards before turning around. That evening, I installed a trail camera aimed at the gate. 2 nights later, the camera caught them. It was the same woman who had been with Barbara during their second visit, sneaking onto my property at 11 p.m. She walked around for about 20 minutes, taking photos with her phone of various buildings and equipment, then left. I showed the footage to Tom. "That's trespassing," he said immediately. "And if they're using those photos as evidence in their case against you, we can argue they were obtained illegally." "Should I call the sheriff?" "Let me think about it. We might be able to use this as leverage. Keep the footage safe and see if they try it again." Meanwhile, Tom's specialist in Native American land law came back with preliminary findings. Her name was Dr. Patricia Delgado, a law professor at the University of New Mexico who had spent 30 years studying tribal treaty rights. Tom Conference called me with her. "Mr. Quinn, I've reviewed the documents you provided and I've been researching the historic land boundaries in your area. What I've found is quite interesting. I'm listening. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War. Part of that treaty required the United States to honor Spanish and Mexican land grants to Pueblos. The Pueblo near your property had a grant that originally encompassed approximately 40,000 acres. Over the years, portions of that land were sold, transferred, or taken through various legal and quasi-legal means. Okay, in 1952, when your grandfather purchased your ranch from the BLM, the federal government was in the process of sorting out which lands were properly federal and which should have remained with the Pueblos. It was a mess. Lots of mistakes were made, and many land transfers that should not have been valid were processed anyway. Are you saying my grandfather's purchase was invalid? No, not at all. But I am saying that the BLM sale documentation references a survey that was later found to be inaccurate. According to a 1968 federal review, several properties sold in the 50s were actually still within the boundaries of the original Pueblo land grant. My heart started beating faster, including mine, potentially. I need to do more research. But the coordinates referenced in your deed, when plotted against the corrected survey maps from 1968, place your property right on the border. It's possible that all or part of your ranch is technically on land that never legally left Pueblo jurisdiction. Tom jumped in. Patricia, if that's true, what does it mean for the HOA claim? It means they have no authority whatsoever. Tribal lands are sovereign. HOAs are creatures of state law. State law does not apply to tribal land. The HOA's entire case would collapse. After the call ended, I sat in my office staring at the wall. This was bigger than I'd expected. If my ranch was on tribal land, it changed everything. Not just the HOA case, but potentially the ownership of the property itself. I called Thomas Whitehorse and told him what Dr. Delgado had said. I'm not surprised, Thomas said. The tribal council has known for years that the boundaries from the treaty were never properly enforced. We've been working to document the true extent of our land, but it's slow work. Thomas, if my ranch is on your land, what does that mean for me? That depends. We would need to have a conversation with the council. But Kenneth, the Pueblo has no interest in taking land from families who have worked it honestly for generations. We're not in the business of dispossessing people. What we are interested in is protecting our sovereignty and preventing exploitation. The HOA is definitely exploitation. Exactly. Let me talk to the council. We might be able to help each other. 2 days later, I got a certified letter from the HOA's legal team. They were filing a lawsuit against me for unpaid dues and seeking an immediate lien on my property. The amount they claimed I owed had somehow grown to $63,000. Tom filed our response, arguing that the HOA had no jurisdiction and that their incorporation was invalid as it pertained to my property. We also filed a counterclaim for harassment and trespassing, including the trail camera footage of the woman sneaking around my ranch. The judge scheduled a hearing for 3 weeks out. During those 3 weeks, the tension escalated. Barbara showed up at my ranch twice more, each time with different board members, trying to serve me with additional violation notices. I refused to accept them. They started posting violations on my gate, which I tore down. Then they went after my business. I received a letter from the New Mexico Livestock Board saying they'd received complaints about my cattle operation and needed to conduct an inspection. I knew immediately who had filed the complaints. The inspector, a tired-looking man named Jeff Morrison, no relation to Emma, showed up and walked through my operation. He checked feed storage, water sources, medical records, grazing rotations, everything. At the end, he shook my head. Mr. Quinn, I don't know who complained about you, but they're full of it. This is one of the cleanest operations I've seen in years. You're in full compliance with every regulation. Can I get that in writing? I'll send you a formal report. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry you got hassled like this. We've been getting a lot of bogus complaints lately from HOA types who don't like having working ranches near their developments. Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate you being straight with me. The report arrived a few days later, and Tom added it to our court filings as evidence of the HOA's bad faith. Meanwhile, Thomas called with news. I spoke with the tribal council. They reviewed the information from Dr. Delgado and conducted their own research. Kenneth, your ranch sits partially on land that is within the original treaty boundaries. Partially. About 600 of your 800 acres. The eastern portion was always outside the grant, but everything west of the creek falls within it. What does that mean, practically? It means we want to help you fight the HOA. The council is prepared to intervene in your case. We'll argue that the HOA's claim affects tribal land and is therefore a federal matter outside state court jurisdiction. Will that work? It should. Once we establish that tribal land is involved, the case has to move to federal court and the legal framework changes entirely. The HOA's state law claims become irrelevant. Thomas, I can't thank you enough. You're a good neighbor, Kenneth. You've never caused us problems, never tried to claim water rights that weren't yours, never disrespected the land. We take care of our neighbors. The tribal legal team filed their motion to intervene 2 days before our scheduled hearing. The motion included detailed historical documentation, survey maps, treaty references, and expert testimony from Dr. Delgado. It was an impressive piece of legal work. Barbara and her HOA team were clearly blindsided. Their lawyer, Richard, filed an emergency response arguing that the tribal intervention was improper and that the land status was irrelevant to the HOA's contractual claims. The hearing was held in State District Court in Albuquerque. I drove up with Tom feeling nervous but also more confident than I had since this whole mess started. The courtroom was small, and only a handful of people were there besides the parties and lawyers. Barbara sat in the front row with Richard and 2 other HOA board members. On our side, Tom sat at the council table, and beside him was Marie Winters, the lead attorney from the tribal legal office. Thomas Whitehorse was there too, sitting in the gallery behind me in a show of support. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Patricia Reeves, entered and we all stood. Please be seated. We're here on the matter of Desert Vista Homeowners Association versus Kenneth Quinn, case number CV 2025-08847. I've reviewed the pleadings, including the motion to intervene filed by the Pueblo. Counselors, this is an unusual situation. Mr. Pemberton, why don't you start by explaining the HOA's position? Richard stood. Thank you, Your Honor. This is actually a straightforward matter. Mr. Quinn's property falls within the boundaries of Desert Vista HOA as established in our incorporation documents filed with the state in 2019. He has failed to pay the required dues for 6 years and has numerous violations of community standards. We're simply seeking to enforce our bylaws and collect what is owed. And Mr. Rodriguez, your response? Tom stood. Your Honor, the HOA's claim is fundamentally flawed. First, Mr. Quinn was never notified of his inclusion in the HOA and never consented to join. Second, and more importantly, the property in question sits on land protected under federal treaty law as tribal territory. The HOA has no authority over tribal land, making their entire case invalid. Judge Reeves looked at Marie. Miss Winters, you're here on behalf of the Pueblo? Marie stood. Yes, Your Honor. The Pueblo moves to intervene in this case because it directly affects our territorial sovereignty. The Quinn Ranch sits on land within our original treaty boundaries, which have never been legally dissolved or properly transferred. This is not a matter of state law or HOA bylaws. This is a matter of federal treaty rights and tribal sovereignty. Richard jumped up. Your Honor, this is a transparent attempt to avoid legitimate financial obligations. The tribal claims are legally irrelevant and highly suspect. I would note that the Pueblo has conveniently never claimed this land before, only raising the issue once Mr. Quinn faced accountability for his violations. Marie's expression hardened. Counsel's characterization is both inaccurate and offensive. The Pueblo has been documenting and asserting our treaty rights for decades. We have extensive records of our efforts to correct the historic boundary errors, and I would point out that it's the HOA, not the Pueblo, that suddenly claimed jurisdiction over land they have no right to touch. Judge Reeves held up her hand. Let's keep this civil. Ms. Winters, do you have documentation supporting the tribal land claim? We do, Your Honor. Extensive documentation. Marie handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. Judge Reeves spent several minutes flipping through the documents, her expression neutral. Finally, she looked up. This is beyond my expertise to evaluate quickly, and frankly, if there's even a colorable claim that this involves tribal treaty rights, I'm not sure this court has jurisdiction. Federal law preempts state law when it comes to tribal sovereignty, Richard protested. Your Honor, we're talking about HOA dues, not tribal sovereignty. This is not a federal matter. Mr. Pemberton, if the land in question is tribal land, then an HOA attempting to assert authority over it absolutely implicates sovereignty. I'm not going to wade into treaty interpretation without proper briefing and possibly expert testimony. She paused, thinking, here's what I'm going to do. I'm staying all proceedings in this case pending a determination of the land status question. Ms. Winters, your motion to intervene is granted. The parties will have 60 days to conduct discovery on the land boundary issues. We'll reconvene after that for a full evidentiary hearing. Barbara stood up from her seat. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. He owes money. He should pay. Judge Reeves fixed her with a cold stare. Madam, I don't know who you are, but you need to sit down and be quiet or I'll have you removed from my courtroom. Barbara sat, her face red. Are we clear on the schedule? Judge Reeves asked the lawyers. Everyone nodded. Good, 60 days. I want thorough briefing on the jurisdictional and land status issues. Dismissed. As we filed out of the courtroom, Barbara cornered me in the hallway. You think you're clever, hiding behind the Indians? I'd watch what you say next, Tom warned her. We're in a courthouse surrounded by witnesses. This isn't over, Barbara hissed. We will get what we're owed. You're not owed anything, I said calmly. You tried to shake down the wrong person. Thomas approached and Barbara actually took a step back. There was something about his presence that commanded respect, or maybe fear in her case. Mrs. Henderson, Thomas said quietly, you should understand something. The Pueblo does not take kindly to people trying to steal our land or intimidate our neighbors. If you continue down this path, you'll find yourself in federal court facing much more serious consequences than a denied HOA claim. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you about the reality of your situation. Take it as you will. We left Barbara fuming in the hallway. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Delgado and the tribal legal team worked together to build an airtight case for the land status. They dug through centuries of records, from Spanish colonial documents to Mexican territorial papers to U.S. government surveys and treaty texts. They interviewed historians, reviewed archaeological evidence, and traced every single transfer of property in the area. What they found was damning, not just for the HOA's case against me, but for several other property claims in the region. The original Pueblo land grant had been for 42,000 acres. Over the years, through a combination of legitimate sales, fraudulent transfers, and bureaucratic errors, the Pueblo had been reduced to about 15,000 acres of recognized land. But the legal documentation showed that many of those transfers were invalid under federal law. My ranch was one of several properties that had been incorrectly removed from Pueblo jurisdiction. The Bureau of Land Management sale in 1952 should never have happened because the BLM did not actually own the land to sell. It was still Pueblo land under the treaty. When Tom explained this to me, I had a moment of panic. Does that mean I don't actually own my ranch? Not necessarily, he said. The Pueblo has indicated they're willing to work with affected landowners. They're not trying to evict people who have lived and worked the land in good faith for generations. What they want is formal recognition of their sovereignty over the territory and a path to properly lease or transfer the land to current occupants. So I'd be leasing from the Pueblo, potentially. But Kenneth, that might actually be better for you. Tribal land is protected from a lot of state and local regulations, including HOA claims. The HOA, meanwhile, was getting desperate. They hired additional lawyers and started making increasingly aggressive arguments. Richard filed a motion claiming that the tribal intervention was fraudulent and that Thomas and the council members should be sanctioned for abuse of process. That backfired spectacularly. The federal government noticed about a week after Richard filed his sanctions motion. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of New Mexico filed a notice that they were monitoring the case due to its implications for federal treaty law. They also sent investigators to look into the HOA's practices. It turned out that the federal government had been interested in Desert Vista HOA for a while. They'd received complaints from other landowners about the HOA's expansion tactics and suspicious connections between board members and real estate development companies. When I heard about the federal investigation, I called Tom. Is this real? Very real. The U.S. Attorney's Office doesn't get involved in HOA disputes unless they suspect serious wrongdoing. I'm guessing they found something worth pursuing. What they found was fraud, lots of it. The federal investigation revealed that Barbara Henderson and 2 other board members, including Richard Pemberton, were partners in a real estate investment company called Highland Properties, LLC. Highland had been systematically using the HOA to pressure landowners into selling their properties at below market prices, then flipping those properties to developers for massive profits. The scam worked like this. The HOA would claim jurisdiction over a property, assess huge fees and fines, and when the owner couldn't pay, they'd offer to help by purchasing the property through Highland. The owner, facing liens and legal fees, would sell at a discount. Highland would then immediately resell to a developer for 2 or 3 times what they'd paid. Over 5 years, they'd done this to 17 properties, making more than $12 million in profit. And it got worse. Some of the violations they'd cited were completely fabricated. They'd literally made up rules about paint colors, fence heights, and landscaping that didn't actually exist in the HOA bylaws, then fined people for violating those non-existent rules. The U.S. attorney filed federal criminal charges against Barbara, Richard, and a man named Gordon Matthews, the HOA treasurer. The charges included wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violating the civil rights of landowners through unlawful property schemes. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly Desert Vista HOA was infamous. Reporters showed up at my ranch asking for interviews. I declined most of them, but I did talk to a reporter from the Albuquerque Journal who seemed genuinely interested in the larger story about land rights and tribal sovereignty. The article that resulted was detailed and fair. It explained the history of the Pueblo land grant, the legal questions around my ranch, and the HOA's fraudulent schemes. It also profiled several other victims of the HOA's tactics, including an elderly couple who'd lost their home after being hit with $80,000 in bogus fines. Public opinion turned hard against the HOA. Desert Vista residents started questioning their own board and demanding investigations into where their dues money had actually gone. It turned out Barbara and her cronies had been paying themselves enormous salaries and consulting fees, while the community's roads and common areas were neglected. Our court date arrived. This time, the courtroom was packed. Journalists, interested lawyers, other landowners who'd been targeted by the HOA, and tribal members all came to watch. Judge Reeves took the bench and reviewed the massive amount of documentation that had been submitted over the past 60 days. "I've read everything," she began. "The historical analysis, the expert reports, the survey maps, the treaty documents, and I've also been informed of the federal criminal charges filed against several of the defendants' board members. This has become a much larger case than a simple HOA dispute." Richard, looking pale and nervous, stood. "Your Honor, I'm no longer representing the HOA in this matter. I've withdrawn as counsel." "I'm aware, Mr. Pemberton, though I understand you'll be needing counsel of your own soon." Judge Reeves did not hide her disdain. "The HOA has retained new counsel?" A young woman stood. "Yes, Your Honor. Sarah Chen on behalf of Desert Vista HOA. Your Honor, in light of the recent developments, the HOA wishes to withdraw all claims against Mr. Quinn and to formally apologize for any distress caused." "A bit late for apologies," Judge Reeves said dryly, "but I'll accept the withdrawal. However, we still need to resolve the underlying jurisdictional questions." "Ms. Winters?" Marie stood. Your Honor, the Pueblo and Mr. Quinn have reached an agreement, subject to the court's determination of the land status. If the court finds that the Quinn Ranch sits on land within the Pueblo's treaty boundaries, Mr. Quinn will enter into a long-term lease agreement with the Pueblo, recognizing their sovereignty while allowing him to continue operating his ranch. The lease terms are favorable and protect Mr. Quinn's rights as a long-time occupant. Mr. Quinn, you're agreeable to this? Judge Reeves asked me directly. Yes, Your Honor. The Pueblo has been nothing but fair and supportive. I'm honored to work with them. Judge Reeves nodded. Based on the extensive evidence presented, I find that the preponderance of evidence supports the conclusion that the Quinn Ranch sits on land within the original Pueblo Treaty boundaries. Those boundaries were never properly dissolved or legally transferred. Therefore, the land remains under Pueblo jurisdiction pursuant to federal treaty law. She looked at the new HOA lawyer. Ms. Chen, your clients never had any authority over Mr. Quinn's property. Not only is your claim dismissed, but I'm ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Quinn's legal fees and to file a formal correction with the county removing any reference to his property in your incorporation documents. Is that clear? Yes, Your Honor. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the State Bar for investigation into Mr. Pemberton's conduct. An attorney should know better than to participate in a fraudulent scheme like this. The gavel came down, and just like that, it was over. The HOA's case was dead. My ranch was safe. And more than that, the truth about the land status was finally recognized. After the hearing, Thomas and I stood outside the courthouse with Marie and Tom. Thank you, I said to Thomas. I literally couldn't have done this without you. We helped each other, Thomas replied. This case established important precedent for other properties in the area. You helped us protect land that's rightfully ours. What happens now? Now we formalize the lease agreement. You'll continue running your ranch exactly as you always have. The only difference is you'll be paying a modest annual lease fee to the Pueblo instead of property taxes to the county. And you'll have the protection of tribal sovereignty, which means no HOA or developer can ever touch you again. That sounds perfect, Marie added. And the Pueblo is planning to work with other landowners in similar situations. What we've learned from your case will help dozens of families. Over the next few months, everything wrapped up. Barbara Henderson, Richard Pemberton, and Gordon Matthews were convicted on multiple federal fraud charges. Barbara got 8 years in federal prison. Richard got 6 years and was disbarred. Gordon got 5 years. The civil cases that followed resulted in millions of dollars in restitution to the families they'd defrauded. Some people got their properties back. Others received cash settlements. The elderly couple who'd lost their home got it back plus damages. Desert Vista HOA itself was essentially dissolved. The remaining board members who weren't involved in the fraud voted to dramatically scale back the HOA's scope and powers. They focused on maintaining common areas and roads, which is what an HOA should do, and stopped trying to control every aspect of people's lives. I signed my lease agreement with the Pueblo in a small ceremony at the tribal office. Thomas and the council members were there, and we shared a meal afterward. The lease was for 99 years renewable, at a rate that was actually lower than my property taxes had been. And most importantly, it explicitly protected my right to run the ranch as a working cattle operation without interference. Your grandfather would be proud, Thomas told me. He bought this land honestly, worked it well, and now his grandson is ensuring it stays protected for future generations. I'm proud to be part of this, I said honestly. It feels right. Life returned to normal after that, or as normal as it gets on a ranch. Miguel and Carlos and I went back to focusing on cattle and fences and the daily work that never really stops. But there was a new piece in it. I didn't have to worry about harassment or bogus fines or losing the land my family had worked for 70 years. Emma Morrison called me one day a few months later. Ken, I just heard the Pueblo is offering lease agreements to other landowners in the area. I'm thinking about taking them up on it. You should, I told her. Best decision I made. No more HOA troubles, not even a possibility. Tribal land is untouchable by those vultures, she laughed. I'll talk to Thomas this week. The story got some national attention too. Several news outlets ran features about the case, focusing on different angles. Some emphasized the HOA fraud. Others focused on the tribal sovereignty issues. A few explored the complex history of land rights in the Southwest. I did a couple of interviews, mostly to raise awareness about HOA overreach and predatory practices. I wanted other people facing similar situations to know they had options and rights. One reporter asked me if I was angry about everything that had happened. I was at first, I admitted, but now I'm just grateful it worked out. Barbara and her friends were criminals, and they're paying for what they did. I got to keep my ranch and formed a good partnership with the Pueblo. And maybe some good came out of it by exposing what these predatory HOAs are doing. Do you have any advice for other property owners facing HOA disputes? Don't roll over. These organizations count on people being too scared or too broke to fight back. But there are resources out there. Good lawyers, legal aid organizations, and sometimes unexpected allies. In my case, it was the Pueblo. For someone else, it might be different. But the key is, don't just accept that they have power over you. Question their authority. Make them prove their claims. And don't be afraid to dig into the history of your land and your rights. The interview ran in several papers and online. I got emails from people all over the country thanking me for speaking up and sharing their own HOA horror stories. It was eye-opening how common these abuses were. A year after the whole mess started, I was standing on my porch drinking coffee again when I saw a vehicle coming down the drive. For a split second, my stomach clenched, remembering Barbara's silver Mercedes. But this was a pickup truck, and when it got closer, I recognized Thomas behind the wheel. "Morning," I called as he got out. "Morning, Kenneth. Thought I'd stop by and see how things are going. Can't complain. Just finished shipping a load of cattle. Good prices this year." "Glad to hear it." Thomas looked out over the land, the high desert stretching away toward the mountains. "I wanted to let you know the council is planning a celebration next month. 20 families have signed lease agreements now, reclaiming protection for about 15,000 acres of treaty land. We want to mark the occasion." "That's incredible. None of it would have happened without your case setting the precedent. You gave people hope and a legal path forward." He turned to me. "You're an honorary member of the community now, whether you like it or not." I smiled. "I like it just fine." Thomas stayed for coffee and we talked about cattle and weather, and the normal things neighbors discuss. But underneath it was the satisfaction of knowing we'd fought something unjust and won. Not just for ourselves, but for a lot of people. After he left, I walked out to the south pasture where Miguel and Carlos were working on a water line. The cattle were grazing peacefully. The sky was that particular shade of desert blue that never gets old, and my land was secure. Barbara Henderson had thought she could intimidate me into paying for something I didn't owe, force me into an HOA I never joined, maybe even push me off land my family had worked for generations. She'd counted on me being isolated and overwhelmed. She hadn't counted on the history of the land itself, on treaty rights that predated her fraudulent bylaws by 150 years. She hadn't counted on allies like Thomas and the Pueblo, or good lawyers like Tom and Marie. And she definitely hadn't counted on me being stubborn enough to fight instead of fold. In the end, justice came for Barbara and her accomplices. They lost everything: their freedom, their reputations, their ill-gotten gains. Meanwhile, I kept everything that mattered. My ranch, my livelihood, my family's legacy, and I gained something too. A deeper connection to this land and its true history. An understanding of the complex layers of ownership and sovereignty that made it special. A partnership with the Pueblo that honored both their ancient claim and my family's decades of honest work. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd just paid Barbara that first $47,000 she demanded. Maybe she'd have left me alone. Or maybe she'd have just kept coming back with more demands and more violations until I lost everything anyway. I'm glad I fought. Not just because I won, but because fighting was the right thing to do. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, even when they hide behind official-sounding organizations and legal threats. The sun was setting over the Sandia Mountains as I headed back to the house. Miguel and Carlos waved goodbye as they drove off in their truck. Inside, I had paperwork to do, bills to pay, all the normal ranch business that fills the evenings. But first, I stood on the porch for a moment, looking at the land that stretched away in every direction. My land, the Pueblo's land. Shared land protected by law and honor and mutual respect. Barbara Henderson's silver Mercedes would never kick up dust on this driveway again. The HOA had no power here. The land was safe, protected by something stronger than bylaws or liens or threats. It was protected by truth, by history, by the simple fact that some things can't be bought or stolen or intimidated away. Tribal sovereignty had stood for centuries before Desert Vista HOA existed, and it would stand for centuries after that corrupt organization was forgotten. I finished my coffee and went inside, satisfied with the day and the victory, and the knowledge that tomorrow I'd wake up and do it all again, working this good land that had found its way back to its true owners, while letting me continue the work my grandfather started 70 years ago. That felt like justice, real justice, not the fake kind Barbara had tried to impose with her violation notices and manufactured fees. The kind of justice that acknowledges complicated truths and finds solutions that honor everyone who deserves honoring. The Quinn Ranch would endure. The Pueblo's treaty rights would be respected. And somewhere in a federal prison, Barbara Henderson would have a long time to think about what happens when you try to steal what isn't yours and discover too late that you picked the wrong target. I smiled at that thought, turned off the porch light, and went inside to enjoy the peace of an honest day's work on land that was finally, fully, legally protected from people who thought they could claim it just by drawing lines on a map. They learned differently. We all did. and the lesson would stick for a good long time.